"There's no way that's his car," Officer Brett Calloway said, and he said it before he touched the radio, before he ran the plate, before he had a single legal reason to do anything at all. He was parked in the shade of a maple tree on Aldermore Drive, a quiet residential street in the Cedarfield neighborhood of Nashville, Tennessee, on a Saturday morning in late September, when the air still carried that particular sweetness of summer, refusing to surrender to fall. The lawns on both sides of the street were freshly cut, still damp at the edges from overnight sprinklers. A woman 3 houses down was walking a golden retriever, moving slowly, stopping every few feet to let the dog investigate something in the grass. 2 boys on bicycles weaved around each other at the far end of the block, laughing about something too distant to hear. Nothing about the morning suggested that anything was about to happen that would eventually reach the federal government. Then the Lamborghini turned the corner. It was a Urus midnight blue matte finish that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, moving at a measured and unhurried pace through the neighborhood, the deep controlled sound of its engine barely audible with the windows up. 22-inch wheels, custom trim around the door, panels the kind of vehicle that in certain neighborhoods would cause heads to turn in open admiration. In Cedarfield, a neighborhood that was predominantly white and comfortably wealthy, it caused something different to stir in Officer Brett Calloway's chest. Something that had no name in any law enforcement manual, but had been living inside him for 11 years without ever being examined. Calloway said nothing else. His partner that morning, Officer Simone Pratt, was 26 years old and in her 2nd year on the force, and she heard the comment but said nothing back. She had already learned that certain observations from senior officers were not invitations to discuss. They were simply weather, something you noted and waited to pass. Calloway put the cruiser in drive before he touched the radio. He did not turn on the lights immediately. He simply followed, maintaining 3 car lengths of distance, watching the Lamborghini signal properly. At the stop sign, come to a full and legal stop, then continue forward. He followed it for another 2 blocks before reaching for the light bar switch. The man behind the wheel of the Lamborghini was Darnell Hayes, 44 years old, and he saw the blue lights appear in his rearview mirror at the moment he was thinking about whether to stop for coffee before or after the grocery store. He had been awake since 6:30. He had already helped his youngest with a backpack zipper that wouldn't cooperate and reminded his older one about a library book due Monday. It had been until this precise moment an entirely ordinary Saturday morning. He eased toward the curb without any hurry, turned off the music he had been listening to Coltrane at low volume, and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. He did not check himself in the mirror. He did not rehearse what he would say. He simply breathed steadily and deliberately, the way a person breathes when they have been in difficult situations before and have learned that the quality of their breathing matters more than almost anything else. Calloway did not walk directly to the driver's window. That was the first thing Simone noticed. He went around the back of the Lamborghini first, taking his time, his eyes moving across every surface of the vehicle, with an attention that had nothing to do with checking for violations and everything to do with something more personal and harder to justify. His fingertips trailed lightly along the rear quarter panel as he passed a gesture so brief it might have been accidental if Simone hadn't been watching closely enough. He stopped at the back corner and looked through the rear glass into the interior cream leather seats, a manila envelope resting flat on the passenger side, everything clean and precisely arranged. Then he looked at Darnell Hayes, still sitting perfectly still, with both hands visible on the steering wheel, and something in Calloway's expression shifted in a way that Simone would spend the next several days trying to find the right word for. She stayed near the passenger side of the cruiser. She noticed that Calloway had not activated his body camera yet. In training, they had been told that cameras should be on before any approach to a stopped vehicle. She noted the deviation and said nothing about it. When Calloway finally reached the driver's window, he stood slightly back from it, which forced Darnell to look up, and slightly behind him, a small asymmetry of posture that communicated authority through geometry rather than words. "Registration and insurance," he said. No greeting, no explanation, no indication of what traffic law had been violated to justify the stop. Darnell's voice when he responded was even and unhurried. "Good morning, officer. May I ask what violation you observed?" The question was precise, polite, the kind of question that someone asks when they already know the answer doesn't matter, but they want the asking of it on record. Calloway ignored it entirely. Registration, insurance. Now, Darnell retrieved both documents from the glove compartment, with movements that were slow and entirely visible, handing them through the window with 2 fingers, as though presenting something at a reception desk. Calloway took them, looked at the name, Darnell A. Hayes, 4417. Aldermore Drive, the address 3 blocks from where they were currently standing, and then looked at Darnell with an expression that could not quite conceal its own confusion. The papers said the man belonged here. Everything else Calloway believed said otherwise. He asked about employment. He asked in the particular way that suggested the answer would be used as evidence against the person giving it. And when Darnell answered private financial consulting, the thin, humorless smile that crossed Calloway's face lasted only a moment before he turned and walked back to the cruiser. Darnell returned both hands to the wheel and waited. 12 minutes passed. Darnell counted them not obsessively, but with the steady internal awareness of someone who had learned that time itself was data. He did not look angry. His jaw was not tight. His hands had relaxed slightly from their formal 10 and 2 position, and now rested more naturally along the lower arc of the wheel, the way a person's hands rest when they are simply waiting for something they already expected. A neighbor 2 houses down came out to retrieve something from her mailbox, saw the police cruiser with its lights still turning quietly in the morning air, and went back inside without making eye contact with anyone. Through the rearview mirror, Darnell could see Calloway and a sergeant, who had arrived in a second vehicle standing near the front bumper of the cruiser, talking in the low, leaning-in manner of men who are building a version of a story rather than discovering one. He couldn't hear a word, but he had sat in enough rooms, conducted enough interviews, reviewed enough body camera footage over the past 8 months to understand precisely the kind of conversation that posture produced. 7 months and 3 weeks earlier, Darnell had driven into Nashville for the first time in his professional capacity and sat in a federal building downtown, reviewing a folder that contained, among other things, a statistical analysis of traffic stops in Davidson County over a 26-month period. 847 stops. 71% of the drivers stopped were black. Black residents made up 34% of the population in the affected areas. The numbers didn't tell the whole story. Numbers never did. But they told the shape of it, and the shape was unmistakable. He glanced down at his left wrist. The watch looked like a good watch silver case, simple face, the kind of thing a successful man might wear without drawing attention. The kind of thing that had been recording continuous audio and video since the moment he left his driveway that morning, transmitting in real time to an encrypted server maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Behind him, Calloway and the sergeant reached some kind of conclusion. He could tell from the way their postures changed. Calloway's shoulders dropped slightly, the way shoulders drop when permission has been given rather than earned. The sergeant walked back to his vehicle. Calloway turned toward the Lamborghini. Across the street, a man in his 60s, who had been moving through his morning walk, had stopped completely on the sidewalk. He was looking at the scene without pretending to do anything else. His expression was the expression of a man who had seen this particular shape of morning before and knew that the people inside it rarely got to decide how it ended. Calloway reached the driver's window. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. Darnell stepped out with the same deliberate slowness he had used for everything else that morning, keeping his hands visible, and in front of him, his movements narrated by their own careful visibility. The door swung open. He placed one hand on the roof frame, and he stood up into the September air with the unhurried manner of a man who understands that how he moves in this moment matters more than almost anything he could say. The sun was fully established now, past the gentleness of early morning, and into something with actual weight, the kind of late September Nashville heat that makes the top of your head feel like it's being pressed by a warm hand. The asphalt in front of the Lamborghini reflected it back upward in faint distortions. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started up, ran for 30 seconds, then stopped, as though even the machine had decided to wait and see. Simone Pratt stood approximately 4 meters back, and to the left, her hands at her sides, her face carefully neutral in the practiced way of someone managing an internal reaction they haven't yet decided what to do with. She watched Calloway begin the search, pockets, waistband, shoes, and she watched Darnell Hayes stand through all of it, with an absolute stillness that felt less like submission and more like patience, the deep-settled kind that belongs to people who have already made their decisions and are simply waiting for events to catch up. The search found nothing. Of course it did. Calloway moved through it with an efficiency born of repetition, and when the final pocket came up empty, something crossed his face that Simone had seen before on different faces. In different situations, the particular frustration of a person whose conclusion preceded their investigation and who now had to deal with the embarrassment of the facts. It was not the expression of a man relieved to find that a citizen was innocent. It was the expression of a man annoyed that his instincts had failed to produce the result he'd already written in his head. His attention moved to the passenger seat. Through the window, the manila envelope was clearly visible, sealed flat approximately 9 inches by 12, nothing written on the outside. "What's in the envelope?" Calloway asked, and his tone had shifted from the procedural flatness of the initial stop to something with an edge in it, a sharpness that belongs to conversations that have stopped being about the law and started being about something else. "Personal documents," Darnell said. "Open it." "I don't consent to a search of my vehicle." The statement was clean and factually accurate, and delivered without any agitation, which seemed to be precisely the problem for Calloway, because men like Calloway were accustomed to refusals, arriving with emotion attached, and emotion gave you something to work with. Plain, calm legal assertion gave you almost nothing. Calloway looked at the envelope. He looked at Darnell. And then, in the particular silence of a man who has stopped listening to anything except the oldest and least examined parts of himself, he made a decision. Simone thought for one brief and mistaken second that Calloway was stepping back to let the matter go. He reached instead for his baton. The swing was practiced, and without hesitation, the motion of a person who has never in 11 years experienced a consequence for actions taken in this particular emotional register. The baton connected with the passenger side window of the Lamborghini in a single clean arc, and the sound that followed was not just glass breaking. It was the sound of something happening in the middle of a quiet residential neighborhood on a Saturday morning when people were mowing lawns and walking dogs and helping their children with backpacks, a sound that moved outward in all directions. At once, through the open kitchen windows of nearby houses, down to the end of the block, where the 2 boys on bicycles had stopped pedaling and were now standing very still astride their bikes, with their mouths slightly open up to the 2nd floor of a cream-colored colonial, where a curtain shifted and a face appeared, and stayed. Simone's first full thought was not about law or procedure or what she was supposed to do next. Her first thought was 3 words that repeated themselves like a stuck record in the back of her mind. Not necessary, not necessary, not necessary. She stood without moving her hands, still at her sides, managing the thing happening in her chest by forcing herself to continue breathing normally, a skill she had not known she would need when she joined the force 2 years ago. The neighbor, the older man who had stopped his morning walk to watch, did not immediately react. He stood on the sidewalk, with his hand moving slowly toward his jacket pocket, and then stopping, hovering there, as if he wasn't sure whether the action of reaching for a phone was something he was allowed to perform, or whether it would somehow make things worse for the man standing next to the broken car. His hand stayed where it was not quite in his pocket, and not quite withdrawn. Calloway reached through the shattered window frame, glass fragments, catching the sunlight on the leather seat below him like scattered diamonds, and grabbed the manila envelope. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, I've got a possible stolen vehicle at Aldermore Drive requesting backup for further investigation." The request bore no relationship to the evidence available to him. The registration had been confirmed and verified 15 minutes earlier. The address on the registration matched the street they were standing on. None of this was relevant to the radio call he was now making, and he knew it. And he made it anyway, because in 11 years, that particular gap between what was true and what he said in his reports had never once collapsed on him. Darnell stood beside the Lamborghini and watched Calloway pull the envelope clear of the window frame. He did not move. He did not speak. He looked at the interior of his car, the fragments of glass resting on the cream leather seat, each one catching a slightly different angle of the morning sun, each one throwing a small and separate point of light across the dashboard. He stood there for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration, and then he thought, with the measured clarity of a man who has been pointing a compass at true north for 8 months, "He just finished it for us." The backup unit arrived within 4 minutes. 2 officers, unfamiliar faces, who pulled up behind the original cruiser and took their positions with the automatic deference of people responding to a call they haven't yet had time to question. Darnell was directed to the rear seat of Calloway's cruiser, not arrested, not formally detained under any articulated legal standard, simply placed there by the accumulated gravity of official posture and the locked door that followed. From where he sat, through the narrow gap of the partially lowered front windows, voices arrived in fragments that were nevertheless entirely sufficient. Calloway was doing most of the talking. He had the tone of a man explaining himself to people who were already on his side, the relaxed, unhurried cadence of someone accustomed to his account of events being accepted without serious examination. He was describing the morning's events in the third person of official narrative, where actions became procedures and decisions became judgments, and the envelope on the passenger seat had become suspicious material requiring investigation, rather than a sealed document belonging to a man whose registration confirmed he lived 3 blocks away. The sergeant who had arrived with the backup unit listened and then asked 2 questions. The first registration came back clean, Calloway clean. The second, after a pause that Simone would later describe as the pause of a man who was hoping the answer would make the next hour easier. "Then what are we still doing here?" Calloway's answer to that question lasted approximately 40 seconds. It would later be transcribed from audio recovered from Darnell's watch. It would be played in a federal briefing room before an audience of more than 20 people. It would be submitted as evidence in proceedings that Calloway, at this particular moment in the morning, sunshine on Aldermore Drive, had no concept, were already in motion, and had been for the better part of a year. Simone heard the answer. She turned and looked in the opposite direction, not to pretend she hadn't heard, but because she needed somewhere else to put her eyes, while she processed what they meant, what they said about where she was working and who she was working beside, and what it meant that she had, until this moment, managed to navigate around the implications of both. 2 blocks away, Reverend Otis Beaumont, 67 years old, was making his Saturday morning walk toward the community center, where he volunteered on weekends, and he turned onto Aldermore Drive and stopped at what he saw a midnight blue Lamborghini with a shattered passenger window, glass fragments, catching the light on the seat inside the owner, standing on the sidewalk with the particular stillness of a man who has decided that stillness is its own form of answer. Reverend Beaumont reached into his jacket pocket and took out the small spiral notebook he had carried everywhere for 6 years. 22 minutes after the lights first appeared in Darnell's rearview mirror, the sergeant came to the rear door of the cruiser and opened it. "You're free to go." 3 words. No documentation, no explanation, no acknowledgement that a man had been removed from his own vehicle and placed in the back of a police car while his property was physically destroyed, and a false radio call was made about it. Just 3 words delivered in the flat and slightly impatient tone of a man completing an administrative task. Darnell stepped onto the pavement. He asked with the same steady precision he had maintained throughout the entire morning whether he would be receiving any documentation related to the detention, the search of his vehicle, or the damage to his property. The sergeant said no. Darnell nodded once, a small and economical movement, and walked toward the Lamborghini. He stood for a moment at the passenger side, looking at the shattered window and the glass still scattered across the leather seat, small pieces catching the light among the larger ones. Then he opened the driver's door and looked across the roof of the car at Officer Brett Calloway, who was standing near the cruiser, watching him with the expression of a man waiting to see whether what he had done would carry any cost at all. Their eyes met. Calloway held the look for a moment, and then something in Darnell's gaze, not anger, not threat, nothing that could be named or reported, simply a quality of absolute and settled certainty, made Calloway shift his weight slightly and look away first. Darnell drove home at exactly the posted speed limit, not 1 mile per hour above it, all the way to 4417 Aldermore Drive. Cheryl Hayes was in the kitchen when she heard the garage door, and she came to the doorway between rooms and looked at her husband as he came through the door from the garage, and she knew. Not from anything specific on his face. Darnell's face had always been difficult to read for people who didn't know him well, but Cheryl had been married to him for 16 years, and she knew the particular quality of the stillness he carried into a room when something had happened that cost him something he wasn't willing to put into words yet. She didn't ask about the window. She found out later when she went to move the car, but in that moment, she simply stepped back from the doorway and let him pass, and he touched her hand briefly as he did, which was its own kind of conversation. He went directly to the home office at the end of the hall and closed the door behind him. The watch came off first, placed carefully on the desk. He connected the small cable to the secure port, opened the encrypted laptop, and watched the upload begin. 51 minutes of continuous audio and video. Every frame of it, time-stamped and geo-tagged, transmitting through 3 layers of federal encryption to a server that existed on no public network. The progress bar moved with the maddening patience of all important things. While it moved, he looked around the room he had been working in for the better part of 8 months. A map of Nashville on one wall marked in 3 colors. A corkboard with printed photographs of streets and intersections. A filing cabinet with labeled folders that contained, among other things, statistical analyses and printed testimonies, and the names of 43 people whose experiences had been documented, reported, and then filed into the administrative silence that passes for resolution in systems that were never designed to correct themselves. The secure phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Deputy Director Carolyn Voss, 4 words: package received. Phase 4 authorized. Darnell read it twice. He did not feel the satisfaction of victory, because this was not the kind of work that produced that feeling. It produced something quieter and more complicated, something closer to the particular weight of knowing that what had been done to him this morning and to 43 other people over the past 2 years could no longer be absorbed and forgotten by the machinery that had been absorbing and forgetting it. The 43 names in Darnell's files did not belong to abstract categories. They belonged to people whose specific and particular experiences he had read so many times that he could recall them the way you recall things you've read in letters rather than reports. Jordan Hill was 21 years old, a second-year medical student at Mehari, and he had been driving home from the university library at 11 on a weeknight in November, when Calloway pulled him over on an empty 4-lane road with no other traffic in either direction. The stop lasted 25 minutes. Jordan's car was searched twice. Nothing was found. Jordan drove the remaining 8 minutes to his apartment, pulled into the parking garage, and sat in his car for over an hour in the dark before going inside, because he didn't want his parents, who were visiting that weekend, to see his face while it still looked the way it looked. He never filed a complaint. When Darnell's team had found him through the statistical cross-referencing of stops and asked if he'd be willing to speak, Jordan had answered the phone on the second ring and said, "I didn't think anyone was actually looking." Diane Moss was 55 years old and the principal of an elementary school on the west side of Nashville. She had been stopped 3 times in 4 months on the same stretch of road she used every morning to get to work. The third time, Calloway said something to her through the window that she would not repeat to anyone for over a year, but that she wrote down that same evening in handwriting so precise it looked typed and sealed in an envelope addressed to the Office of Professional Accountability. She filed a formal complaint. It was marked insufficient evidence for further action 6 days later. Thomas Webb was 71, a retired Army sergeant who had served in 2 conflicts and come home to Nashville because his daughter lived here, and he wanted to be near his grandchildren. He had been ordered out of his vehicle on a wet evening in February, made to stand in the rain for 28 minutes while his car was searched, and sent home with no citation and no explanation. The standing in the rain had aggravated a knee that had been damaged decades ago in circumstances considerably more serious. He had not sought any kind of legal remedy because, as he told Darnell during their one conversation, he had spent a lifetime being told that people like him did not win arguments with authority, and at 71 he was running low on the energy required to be the exception. Darnell had read these accounts so many times that they no longer felt like case files. They felt like obligations. Reverend Otis Beaumont arrived back at the church on Hartwell Avenue at 11:15 on Saturday morning and went directly to the small office behind the sanctuary rather than to the kitchen, where he usually had his mid-morning coffee. The office smelled the way it had smelled for 30 years, old hymnals and wood polish, and something faintly floral from a plant his late wife had given him that had somehow survived everything. He sat down at the desk and opened the spiral notebook. The notebook was nearly full. He had started it 6 years ago on a Tuesday in October, when a young man from the congregation named Marcus, not that Marcus, a different one, a boy who worked at the auto parts warehouse on the south side, had come to see him after Bible study with a bruised wrist and a story about a traffic stop that had lasted 40 minutes and ended with him on the ground without explanation. Reverend Beaumont had written it all down. Date, time, location, badge number the young man had managed to remember. He had sent a letter to the Nashville Police Department. He had received in return a form letter that said the matter had been reviewed. He had kept writing, name after name, year after year. He had sent the accumulated records to the department 4 times in 6 years. The last time he had hand-delivered a photocopy to the office of a city council member and watched the council member's assistant take it from him with the polite and faintly pained expression of someone accepting a gift they have no intention of using. Now he opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date on the location and a brief description of the morning, a midnight blue Lamborghini with a shattered window, the owner standing on the sidewalk with the particular kind of stillness that Reverend Beaumont, after 67 years of watching people in difficult circumstances, recognized as something other than resignation. The man had not looked defeated. He had looked like someone who already knew how this was going to end. Reverend Beaumont closed the notebook and sat quietly for a while thinking about that. The Nashville Metropolitan Police Department's District 7 briefing room smelled on Tuesday morning the way it always smelled burnt coffee from a machine that hadn't been properly cleaned since the previous administration dry erase marker from the weekend duty board, and the particular combination of leather and synthetic fabric that accumulates in rooms where people in uniform spend a lot of time. It was the smell of institutional routine of mornings that were supposed to begin the same way they always did. Brett Calloway was sitting near the windows, leaning back in his chair, with the ease of a man who has walked through enough Tuesdays without consequence that he has stopped anticipating anything different. He was telling two officers across from him about the Lamborghini, stopped describing it in the tone people use when something has been processed from experience into anecdote, slightly compressed, slightly shaped, the edges smoothed to make the structure more satisfying. He used the word entitled twice. He used the phrase "no idea how things work" once. The officers across from him were giving the intermittent nods of people who are following a story and have already decided where their sympathies are going to land. Simone Pratt sat in the far corner with her back to the wall. The coffee in front of her was untouched and had been for 20 minutes. She was looking at her phone, but the screen had gone dark twice since she last actually read anything on it. She was doing the thing she had been doing since Saturday morning, which was trying to find the exact location of the line between what she had witnessed and what she was going to do about it, and coming up each time against the fact that she already knew where the line was and had been standing on the wrong side of it for 2 years. At 8:17, the door opened. The three people who entered did not look like anyone who worked in that building. They moved with a different quality of purpose, not aggressive, not theatrical, simply focused in the way of people who know precisely where they are going and have no ambient uncertainty about whether they belong there. Two men in dark suits moved to either side of the doorway. The woman who walked slightly ahead of them wore a gray blazer and carried a leather portfolio, and she paused just inside the door for a moment, taking in the room with an expression that conveyed neither warmth nor hostility, simply the calm, considered attention of a person conducting an assessment. The room's conversation dropped away in sections first. The officers nearest the door, then the middle rows, then the back. The silence spreading outward like a wave, moving away from a disturbance, until the entire room was quiet, in a way that felt different from the ordinary silence of a briefing about to begin. "I'm Deputy Director Carolyn Voss, Federal Bureau of Investigation." She set her portfolio on the conference table at the front of the room. "We're executing a federal warrant this morning, authorizing the immediate seizure of departmental records, body camera footage, dispatch, communications, and internal correspondence covering the previous 36 months. She opened the portfolio and removed a set of documents without looking up. This action is in connection with an ongoing federal investigation into a pattern of civil rights violations within this department. The investigation has been active for 8 months. The room did not react the way rooms react in movies. No chairs scraping, no voices, no visible movement. It went quiet in a way that was almost perfectly still, the way a room goes quiet when the information in it has just reorganized everyone's understanding of where they are standing. Then Voss said the name. The federal agent assigned to this investigation is Special Agent Darnell Hayes. Calloway's face did something that took several seconds to complete. The color left it in stages. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the table in the posture of a man whose Tuesday had been entirely predictable, moved slowly onto his lap and stayed there. He was seeing in the precise and unwelcome clarity of a man whose mental architecture has just undergone a rapid and involuntary renovation. The driver of the midnight blue Lamborghini, sitting in his rear seat, sitting in his own driveway, sitting in that same settled and patient stillness and understanding for the first time what that stillness had actually been. Voss connected a tablet to the room's wall-mounted screen. The image that appeared was taken from a low angle slightly above waist height, with a wider field of view than a standard body camera, the perspective of something smaller and less obvious. The footage showed Calloway walking around the Lamborghini. It showed his fingertips on the paint. It showed him standing at the rear window for a long moment, looking at the interior, then at the driver. The angle was precise enough to capture the expression on his face during those few seconds, and the expression was unambiguous and would remain in the record permanently. It showed the registration being handed through the window. It showed Calloway's face when he looked at the name and address. It showed him walking back to the cruiser. It showed 12 minutes of Darnell's hands resting on the wheel, and the quality of the silence was remarkable. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deliberate. A man choosing patience with the concentration of someone who understands that everything being recorded matters equally. Then it showed Calloway returning. It showed him reaching for the baton. And then the sound came through the room's speakers, clear and immediate, the specific crack of tempered glass giving way under impact, followed by the clatter of fragments against leather, and in the silence that followed that sound, the briefing room became a very different place than it had been 30 seconds earlier. But the footage continued. It moved into the audio of the period when Darnell sat in the back of the cruiser, and here the room shifted again, because this was the part that none of the officers present had known was being captured. Calloway's voice came through the speakers, his actual voice, in his actual words, speaking to the sergeant about the stop and why they were still there, and what he had made of the situation before he ever walked up to the driver's window. The 40 seconds he had spoken the answer to the question of why they were still there played in full. One officer toward the back of the room let out a breath that was the only sound in the space for several seconds after. Someone else moved their chair, and the sound of it was startling. Simone Pratt was watching the screen with an expression of someone who had needed more than they realized to have what they witnessed confirmed by something outside their own memory. Voss paused the footage and looked at the room. She did not add commentary. The footage had said everything that needed to be said, and adding words to it would have been a diminishment. Voss was opening the next section of the portfolio when Simone Pratt rose from her chair in the corner. The movement was not dramatic. She didn't push back from the table or stand with particular force. She simply stood as people stand when they have finally committed to an action they've been considering for longer than anyone around them knows. But in that room, in that moment, the act of standing was its own form of declaration, and every person in the room felt it, including Calloway, who looked at her with the expression of someone watching a foundation wall develop a crack. "I'd like to make a statement," Simone said. Her voice had a slight unsteadiness in it that she didn't try to hide because hiding it would have required a steadiness she didn't have. And she had decided somewhere in the past 4 days that pretending to be more certain than she was had already cost her more than she was willing to keep paying. Not just about Saturday, about everything. The silence in the room after those 2 sentences was of the kind that contains multiple simultaneous realizations, and all of them pointed in the same direction. Every senior officer in that room understood what a junior officer providing unsolicited testimony to federal investigators meant, not as an abstract procedural matter, but as a specific and immediate fact about the solidity of the structures they had been relying on. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. The anger that might have been there in other circumstances wasn't there, or if it was buried beneath something more basic and more frightening. The recognition that the thing you most counted on to protect you has decided it has other obligations. He looked at the officers on either side of him. Neither of them met his eyes. One of them became very interested in the papers in front of him. The other looked at a fixed point on the wall behind Voss with the focused blankness of a person actively choosing not to be present in the situation they're currently sitting inside. Nobody spoke in Calloway's defense. The silence of the people who had shared shifts with him, laughed at his stories, accepted his version of events for 11 years, said more than any argument could have. It said, "We will not go where you are going." Simone Pratt was the youngest officer in the room. She had less time on the force than anyone else present, and she was the only one standing. Voss looked at her with a measured and professional attention that contained somewhere in its depth a recognition. "We'll schedule your interview for this afternoon," she said. 2 agents arrived at Hartwell Avenue Community Church at 2 o'clock that same Tuesday afternoon. Reverend Beaumont met them at the side entrance and led them through the hall. Past the sanctuary, the smell of candle wax and old wood settling around them as they walked to the small office in the back, where he had already cleared a space on the table and set 2 chairs facing his. He offered them coffee, which they accepted, and then he went to the lower cabinet beside the window and came back with 3 binders, which he set on the table between them without immediate comment, the way a person sets something down when they want it to be seen before it's explained. Each binder was thick, its cover worn at the corners from years of opening and closing. The first agent opened the top one and turned through the first few pages, and then stopped. Looked up. "How long have you been keeping these 6 years?" Reverend Beaumont said. The second agent was already moving through the second binder, and there was a quality to her attention that Reverend Beaumont recognized from certain kinds of listeners, the kind who were not filing what they heard into categories they had already prepared, but actually allowing it to change the shape of what they were understanding. "You sent copies of this material to the department?" she asked. 4 times. "The last time I delivered it by hand to a council member's office." He paused. "The form letter I received in response is in the front pocket of the first binder, if you'd like to see it." She found it and read it. It was 6 sentences long. It thanked him for his concern. Reverend Beaumont watched them work through the pages, names and dates and badge numbers, in his careful handwriting events, described in the plain and specific language of someone who understood that precision was the only form of permanence available to him in the absence of institutional attention. He had written each entry as though the day would eventually come when someone would read it with the authority to act, because the alternative, writing it as though no one ever would, was something he had decided a long time ago he was not willing to do. "These are extraordinary records," one of the agents said eventually without looking up. "They're ordinary stories," Reverend Beaumont replied. "That's the whole point." Jordan Hill was in the Meharry Medical Library, his anatomy notes spread across a table in the corner where the light was better, when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it buzzed again, and something about the repetition made him pick up. "Mr. Hill, this is Agent Patricia Dawes with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm reaching you in connection with a federal investigation involving Officer Brett Calloway of the Nashville Metropolitan Police Department. Our records indicate that you were stopped by Officer Calloway on November 14th of last year. Is that correct?" Jordan stood up from the table without entirely deciding to stand up. He walked out of the reading room into the corridor, which was empty, and stood against the wall, and said, "Yes." His voice came out quieter than he expected. "We'd like to speak with you about that experience," the agent said. "Your account may be important to the investigation." Jordan had not told the story of that November night to anyone. Not to his study partner, not to the friends he had dinner with twice a week, not to his parents during 3 visits home since it happened. He had told no one because there was a part of him that, despite everything he knew intellectually about structural inequality and the documented pattern of policing in his city, had not been entirely certain that his experience was real in the way that could survive the scrutiny of people who hadn't been there. 25 minutes on an empty road, nothing found, no citation, no apology, nothing. He had driven home and sat in the parking garage in the dark because he wasn't ready to let anyone see his face. "Is someone actually investigating this?" he asked. Not for the information he'd already heard the answer, but because he needed to hear it spoken by another human voice. "Yes," Agent Dawes said. "And what you experienced matters." Jordan looked down the corridor toward the window, at the end, where the afternoon light was going soft and golden. He said, I'm ready to talk. Brett Calloway sat at his kitchen table at 7:30 that evening, with the television off and his phone face down on the table beside a glass of water he hadn't touched. The kitchen was a perfectly ordinary kitchen. Good appliances, his wife's plants on the windowsill, his daughter's school schedule attached to the refrigerator, with a magnet from a vacation 4 years ago. He had eaten dinner in this kitchen thousands of times. Tonight, it felt like someone else's room. He had spent the afternoon with his attorney, who was a careful man and had a gift for delivering difficult information in language that was technically neutral, but emotionally devastating, and who had spent most of the meeting explaining the specific differences between the kind of situation that resolved itself through departmental procedure and the kind that resolved itself in federal court. By the time the meeting ended, Calloway had understood with a clarity he could not push away, no matter how he arranged the facts in his head, that what he was looking at was the second kind. He kept coming back to Saturday morning, the weight of the baton in his hand, the ease of the swing, the way he had walked back to his cruiser and picked up the radio and made the call, and how none of it had felt like the kind of thing that was going to matter, because in 11 years, none of it ever had. The complaints filed against him had disappeared. The internal reviews had cleared him. The supervisors who knew had known and done nothing, and their doing nothing, had been a form of permission that he had accepted so long ago. It had stopped feeling like permission and started feeling like the nature of things. He had never in 11 years sat at this table and thought about the people on the other side of those stops as people whose lives continued after he drove away. The thought arrived now unbidden and too large to manage, and he sat with it in the quiet kitchen and did not know what to do with it at all. The federal interview room was smaller than it needed to be and colder than it should have been, the temperature set by an air conditioning system that had never been tuned to human comfort, just to a numerical threshold somewhere in the mid-60s. The light was flat and shadowless, the kind that comes from panels distributed too evenly across a ceiling to leave anywhere for the eye to rest. The chairs were plastic, and the table was laminate, and the one-way glass on the right wall reflected everything with a fidelity that the room's occupant would have preferred it not have. Brett Calloway sat with his hands on the table and his attorney beside him, and he had lost somewhere in the 3 days between Tuesday's briefing room and this Thursday afternoon the particular quality of posture that had characterized 11 years of professional confidence. He was still sitting upright. He was not a man who slouched, but the upright had changed its meaning. He was no longer sitting straight because it projected authority. He was sitting straight because it was the only thing left that he could still control. The investigator across from him was a man named Garrett, who wore an unremarkable suit and asked questions in the flat, unhurried tone of someone who has already read everything in the folder in front of him and is not conducting this conversation to discover information, but to record Calloway's responses as part of a larger document that will outlast the conversation itself. What was your legal basis for stopping the vehicle on Saturday morning? Suspicious driving behavior, Calloway said. Can you define what you observed that constituted suspicious driving? The vehicle appeared out of place in the neighborhood. Garrett made a note. He did not look up. The registration confirmed Mr. Hayes resided at an address on that street, which you verified during the stop, correct? Yes. So following verification of residency, what was your legal basis for continuing to detain him and requesting he exit the vehicle? Calloway's answer to this question took a form that was different from silence, but produced the same effect, which was to demonstrate that no answer existed that would survive the next question. He offered officer safety concerns, then used force concerns, then described the envelope in terms that became less legally coherent the longer he spoke, and Garrett continued writing and asking the next question without challenge or argument, because he didn't need to challenge the structure of the questions, was doing everything that needed to be done. Then Garrett set a printed transcript on the table between them. The 40 seconds of audio from Saturday morning typed out in plain text. Calloway read it slowly. He read it the way a person reads something that they remember producing, but don't quite believe they produced the way you read your own handwriting from a long time ago, and feel the strangeness of recognizing yourself in something you can no longer fully account for. He set the paper down. He looked at it. And then for the first time in 11 years of professional encounters with consequences, Brett Calloway ran out of angles. Not because the investigator had trapped him, because the recording had simply been what happened, and there was nothing between him and it anymore. He looked at the table. The silence that followed was the first entirely honest thing he had produced in the room. Simone sat in a different room with a digital recorder on the table, and no attorney beside her, because she wasn't there as a subject. She was there as a witness, which was a distinction she understood, carried its own weight and its own obligations. Start wherever feels right, one of the investigators said, and she started not with Saturday, but with 6 months earlier, the first week she was assigned to regular shifts with Calloway, because that was where the story actually began, and she was done with the version of events that made it smaller than it was. She described how he chose which vehicles to stop, not by traffic violation, but by a kind of visual arithmetic. She had watched him perform so many times, it had started to seem like procedure, when it had never been anything other than preference. She described the comments made after shifts the way incidents were discussed in the locker room, in language that bore no resemblance to the official reports filed about them. She described the supervisors who laughed, the ones who changed the subject, the ones who said nothing, and how the saying nothing had been indistinguishable in its effect from approval. She stopped at a point in the account and looked at the recorder rather than at either of the investigators. I knew it was wrong. I knew from the first month, and I kept showing up to the same shifts and saying nothing and telling myself it wasn't my place and that I needed more time on the job before I could. She stopped, started again more slowly. None of that was true. I was afraid of being the person who caused a problem, and I need you to know that about me. Not so you'll think better of me for admitting it, but because it's true, and it belongs in the record. When they asked what had made her stand up in the briefing room on Tuesday morning, she considered the question for a long moment before answering. I kept asking myself who I was going to be if I stayed in my chair one more time. She looked up, and I finally couldn't answer it in a way that let me stay. She walked out of the building afterward into early evening air that had turned cool and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling not lighter exactly, but different, like someone who has set down a weight they had carried so long they'd stopped noticing it was there. Darnell came home on Thursday evening to the sound of his daughter explaining something about photosynthesis at high volume, to no one in particular. His son's sneakers squeaking on the kitchen floor as he chased something that turned out to be a rubber ball, and Cheryl calling from somewhere in the back of the house that dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. He stood in the hallway for a moment, just listening to it. He sat at the kitchen table while his daughter worked through her science homework, and she asked him twice to confirm things he couldn't quite follow, and he confirmed them anyway, because she seemed to already know the answers, and his son brought him the rubber ball at one point as an offering, and he accepted it and set it on the table like an important object. After the children were in bed, he and Cheryl sat on the back porch with the outdoor light off the way they did when they wanted to be able to see the stars past the neighbor's oak tree. The night was cool enough for jackets. A dog somewhere 2 streets over was being persistently unhappy about something. Cheryl had a question she'd been holding since Saturday, and she asked it the way she asked all the questions she'd been holding, without preamble directly. Was it worth it? 8 months of your life. All of it. Was it worth it? Darnell looked at the sky past the oak tree for a while before answering. He thought about Jordan Hill sitting in a parking garage for an hour in the dark because he wasn't ready to let anyone see his face. He thought about Thomas Webb standing in the rain on a February evening, his knee hurting, no explanation offered. He thought about Reverend Beaumont writing in his notebook for 6 years, sending letters to a department that responded, with form letters, writing anyway. "Not for me," he said, finally. But for all of them, absolutely. Cheryl reached over and took his hand, and left it there, and they sat together in the dark for a long time, without needing to say anything else. Brett Calloway was arrested on a Friday morning at 6:40 a.m. And the thing that struck the agent who led the arrest team was how small the moment was, not in its legal significance, which was considerable, but in the way it actually happened. Calloway came to the front door in a gray t-shirt when they knocked, and he stood there for a moment, looking at the warrant, and then he said he needed to get his shoes, and they waited, and he came back and sat on the porch step to put them on. And then he stood and walked to the vehicle without being asked. The neighbors on either side were both outside that morning, one collecting the newspaper, one backing out of the driveway, and both of them stopped what they were doing and watched, and nobody said anything. And after Calloway was in the vehicle and it had pulled away from the curb, the neighborhood went back to its morning. The charges were federal deprivation of rights, under color of law, falsification of official records, and civil rights violations, extending across documented interactions over a 26-month period. The department sergeant who had been at the scene on Saturday faced separate charges related to the pattern of complaint suppression that Voss's team had uncovered during the 36-month records review, a consistent cycle in which complaints moved from intake to dismissal through channels that had been organized, whether intentionally or through accumulation, to produce exactly that outcome. The chief of department received a federal compliance order requiring the establishment of an independent civilian oversight board, mandatory review of all body camera footage within 72 hours of any stop resulting in a complaint, and a full re-examination of every complaint filed in the previous 3 years that had been dismissed without meaningful investigation. The department did not resist the order. There had been enough of a reckoning inside the building in the days since Tuesday's briefing that resistance at this point would have been more difficult to organize than compliance. When the news reached Diane Moss, she was at her kitchen table before school, her usual routine, coffee quiet, the Tuesday newspaper. She read the notification on her phone with the careful attention she brought to everything. And then she set the phone down and sat with it for a while. She did not feel triumphant. What she felt was something more private and more significant than that. It was the feeling of having your memory returned to you, of discovering that the thing you experienced was real in all the ways you always knew it was real, but could never get official acknowledgement of. 3 years of wondering if she had somehow been wrong about what happened. 3 years of that particular erosion. And now, in the quiet of her kitchen with her coffee going cold, it was over. Thomas Webb called his daughter. He didn't say much. He said, "Turn on the news." And then, after a pause, "I need you to see this." The congregation at Hartwell Avenue Community Church was larger than usual that Sunday, not by a dramatic margin, but by enough that some of the regular attendees noticed and mentioned it to each other in the quiet before the service began. Word had moved through the neighborhood the way it always moved, not through announcements, but through conversations at gas stations and on front porches and in the parking lot of the grocery store, where half the congregation shopped, and people had come partly for the service and partly to be in the same room as each other at a moment that felt like it meant something. Reverend Beaumont preached his prepared sermon, which was about persistence and was under the circumstances either perfectly appropriate or entirely coincidental, depending on who you asked. At the end of it, before the final hymn, he set his notes aside. He told them about the notebook, about 6 years of Saturday mornings writing down what people brought to him, names and dates and badge numbers, and the 4 letters he had sent that produced nothing more substantial than a form reply. He told it plainly, without theater, the way he told things that were important. He said he had never stopped writing because he believed with the deep and somewhat irrational conviction that was the particular gift of his faith, that the accumulation of truth has a weight that eventually tips the balance of whatever is holding it down. "I didn't change anything in 6 years," he said. "But I kept the truth in a place where I could put my hands on it. And when someone finally came with the right authority and the right questions, I had something real to give them." After the service, a young woman came to him. Barely 20, he thought with the careful and slightly guarded manner of someone who had not yet decided whether to trust the space they were standing in. She said she had a story. She asked if she could tell it. Reverend Beaumont took a new notebook from the desk drawer. "Sit down," he said. Jordan Hill stood outside the federal courthouse on a Thursday morning in November, when the air had finally committed to being cold, the kind of cold that clarifies things, and looked up at the building's stone face for a while before going in. He was wearing the blazer his mother had sent him at the start of medical school, with a note that said, "For important days," and he had not worn it since then. And today had felt like a day that qualified. He gave his name at the security desk. He was directed to a waiting room with chairs along the wall and a window that looked out onto the street below. He sat and watched the traffic for a few minutes, and he let himself, for the first time in 2 years, replay the night in full. Not the version he had compressed and abbreviated and stored in a corner of his memory, where it would take up less space, but the actual version, all 25 minutes of it. The empty road and the flashlight, and the way the officer had moved through his car with a certainty that bore no relationship to the evidence, and then the drive home and the parking garage. He sat with it until they called his name. He took his seat across from the investigator and the federal recorder, and he answered every question he was asked with the kind of precision he had been training for 3 years to bring to medical diagnosis, specific, honest, without embellishment. When they asked why he hadn't filed a complaint at the time, he told the truth. "I didn't believe anyone would care enough to do anything." He paused. "Let it sit there. I was wrong about that. It wasn't a statement of triumph. It wasn't even closure." Not entirely. He understood that things like this didn't close the way you hoped, they just changed shape. But it was something real, something that had not existed 2 years ago on that empty road at 11 o'clock at night, and he was going to let it matter. Brett Calloway stood in federal court in a dark suit on a Wednesday in December, and when the proceedings concluded, he received a sentence that the judge described as proportionate to the specific and documented harm caused to identifiable individuals over an established period, which was the language the law preferred, though everyone in the room understood what it actually meant. Simone Pratt was not in the courtroom. She was on duty assigned now to a different unit, working through a supervised probationary period that she had accepted without complaint because she understood it as exactly what it was, not punishment for Tuesday morning, but the appropriate weight of everything that had come before it. The department's new Civilian Oversight Board held its first formal session the following week, and among its members was a retired educator, a former public defender, and a man named Reverend Otis Beaumont, who arrived carrying a binder, not the 6-year one, which was now part of the federal record, but a new one started the week before that contained on its first page only one thing: a list of the 43 names from Darnell's files, and beside each name, the word heard. The sentencing was not a celebration. The courtroom was not a place where anyone cheered. But in the rows of seats behind the gallery railing, Thomas Webb sat beside his daughter, and Diane Moss sat beside a colleague from her school, and Jordan Hill sat alone near the aisle, and each of them had come for a different reason, and left with something different. But what they shared, what threaded through all of them as they filed quietly out into the December air, was the specific and not easily named feeling of having been part of a true account of events, and of having that account finally officially belong to the record. On the first Saturday in January, Darnell Hayes left the house at 8 in the morning to go to the grocery store, which was the same errand he had been running when his life intersected with Brett Calloway's 4 months earlier. He drove the family SUV, a dark gray 7-passenger vehicle with 3 juice box stains on the second-row seat and his son's soccer cleats in the cargo area. The Lamborghini was in the garage repaired, occasionally driven a reminder that lived quietly in the background of ordinary life. He stopped at the intersection of Aldermore and Harwell, 2 blocks from his house, waiting for a light that cycled through its sequence the way it always did. The corner looked exactly the same as it had in September. The maple on the left had lost its leaves, and the yard on the right had a wreath on the mailbox that hadn't been there before, but the sidewalk and the street were the same. A boy on a bicycle came around the corner and pedaled away toward the other end of the block, standing up on the pedals to build speed the way kids do when they think they can go faster than they are. The light turned green. Darnell drove. On a Tuesday afternoon in early February, Reverend Otis Beaumont sat at his desk in the small office behind the sanctuary and opened the new notebook to a page near the front. He had been writing in it for several months now, and the writing had changed character from what it used to be. There were still names, still dates, still careful accounts of things that needed to be in the record somewhere. But interspersed among them now were other entries, names with notes beside them. Jordan Hill testified. Case documented. Heard. Diane Moss complaint formally substantiated. Heard. Thomas Webb record corrected. Heard. He wrote for a while, and then he put down the pen and looked out the window at the late afternoon sky, which had the particular gray-blue quality of a winter Tuesday in Nashville, unremarkable and quietly beautiful in the way of things that aren't trying to be anything other than what they are. His shoulders, he noticed, were lower than they used to be when he sat at this desk. The years of holding the posture of a man preparing to be ignored had left a tension in them that he had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the weight of something you carry every day. He was only noticing its absence now. On a morning in March, Simone Pratt was on patrol when she saw a colleague's vehicle stopped at a crossroads with a Lexus pulled over in front of it. The driver of the Lexus was a young black man, mid-20s, who was sitting with his hands on the wheel, the way people sit when they are very carefully doing everything right. Simone pulled her cruiser in behind her colleague's vehicle and stepped out. She didn't speak. She didn't intervene. She simply walked to a position where she was visible and stood there, her badge catching the early light, her attention resting on the scene with the calm and unambiguous weight of a witness who is there on purpose. Her colleague looked over, paused, said a few words to the driver, returned the documents, and walked back to the cruiser. The Lexus pulled away. The young man inside it probably never knew what had almost happened, or what had caused it not to. Simone got back in her vehicle. No one thanked her. The radio crackled with the next call, and she answered it and drove toward the day. If this story stayed with you, if you saw someone you know in it, or something true about the world we're living in, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is for the people who never stop believing the truth that mattered.